soon after, I just came straight out with it. I said, they tell me the farmhouse is haunted. And he said, well, I don't know myself, but the carpenter before me, he swore the place was haunted. And so this was enough for me. I was intrigued. I decided to spend my second year with my friends living in this old farmhouse. Well, I've written 4 books. My first was originally titled Parapsychology and the Skeptics. That was later renamed to Science and Psychic Phenomena. The third book was called Science and the Afterlife. All of my books are an attack on the skeptical fortress. But if the first 3 can be thought of as an armada, then this one, my latest, The Case for the Afterlife, should be thought of as a surgical strike.
Today's guest is Chris Carter. Chris Carter is an Oxford-trained philosopher and is the author of 4 highly acclaimed books and several scholarly articles.
Myself, I was becoming increasingly convinced by the evidence that we survived the deaths of our bodies. And I was wondering if I was fooling myself. And so I decided to see what arguments or evidence there was to the contrary. I came across a website devoted to debunking the belief in an afterlife. I wrote to the author. He wrote back, and we engaged in an online debate over several weeks. I gained great insight into the so-called skeptical way of thinking, and I was appalled by his ignorance and by the vehemence of his arguments. The quotes he supplied from other so-called skeptics were equally unimpressive. These modern so-called skeptics are not skeptics at all. They're deniers.
So now for my conversation with Chris. So today I'm speaking with Chris Carter, an Oxford-trained philosopher, and he is author of quite a few books, including The Case for the Afterlife. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much for coming on. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your books?
Okay, well, I've written 4 books. My first was originally titled Parapsychology and the Skeptics. It was a critical examination of the arguments of the so-called skeptics of parapsychology. That was later renamed to Science and Psychic Phenomena. Not my choice. My first publisher went under, and my second publisher insisted on renaming it against my will. My second book was called Science and the Near-Death Experience. Again, a name I don't like, but I'm stuck with it. It's an examination of the near-death experience. The third book was called Science and the Afterlife. Again, don't like the title, but and that's an examination of the other lines of evidence in addition to the near-death experience for the afterlife. All of my books are an attack on the skeptical fortress. But if the first 3 can be thought of as an armada, then this one, my latest, The Case for the Afterlife, should be thought of as a surgical strike. It's much more tightly focused, and it puts the finishing touches on the arguments that I developed in my first 3 books.
Interesting. And I just have to comment when you said how you don't like your titles. As someone who's written books called WTF Just Happened, I ended up self-publishing for this. That was an issue. Definitely some agents I spoke to. And, it was just so tied into my brand that I made a choice that maybe not everyone would with that. But I want to then also ask you, scholarly articles. You talked a little about your books. Is there a scholarly article or 2 you'd like to share related to this topic?
Well, they mostly appeared in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, but there was also a book that came out edited by Stan Krippner. It was titled Debating Psychic Experiences. And in this book, I was asked to contribute 2 articles. Basically, and so were many of the so-called skeptics, Ray Hyman, James Alcock, and a few others, Richard Wiseman. And in the first half of the book, we basically submit essays stating our case. In the second half of the book, we comment on the essays submitted by the others. And so anyway, I submitted 2 essays, and if anyone wants to read these essays, again, they're in the book, Debating Psychic Experiences. They can see how thin-skinned and ruffled the so-called skeptics were by the essay that I wrote in part 1.
Yeah, and we've had Dr. Stanley Krippner on as a guest previously. If any of you guys listening want to check out that episode too. And yeah, I definitely want to get into a lot about the skeptics and thin-skinned, and because it was definitely a life changer for me in my early grief when I assumed the skeptics had all the answers and excuse me, and discovered that maybe they weren't the idealized, thorough investigators I'd always grown up thinking they were. But what motivated you to write these books?
Oh, well, I suppose when I was in college and university doing my second degree, the first year, it was a 2-year program. And the first year I was living at a student residence. And one evening I was talking to one of my friends in his room, and he attempted to convince me to spend the next year, our second year, living in a farmhouse which was owned by our college, which lay on farmland just outside of town. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to make the move. The residence was much closer to town and college. But he was very persistent, and he ended up telling me that the farmhouse was haunted. I really didn't know what to think of this. I said, "Has anyone seen anything?" And he said, "No, but there's been a lot of strange reports and of things people have heard." And so I went out to see the farmhouse for myself. It was a 2-story stone house built in medieval times. And the college carpenter had his workshop on the property. So I stopped in for a chat. And soon after, I just came straight out with it. I said, "They tell me the farmhouse is haunted." And he said, "Well, I don't know myself, but the carpenter before me, he swore the place was haunted." And so this was enough for me. I was intrigued. I decided to spend my second year with my friends living in this old farmhouse. To make a long story short, I did see and hear some things which I could not readily explain, and this sort of perked my interest. When I returned to Canada, I wondered if anybody had done any serious research on topics such as hauntings and so forth. So on a visit to the local library, I was amazed by how much information, how much research had been done over the years. And particularly impressive to me was the research conducted by the British and American Societies for Psychical Research. The British Society was founded in 1882, and its first president was a philosopher at Cambridge named Henry Sidgwick. 2 years later, the American Society was founded with William James, a philosopher at Harvard, as its first president. Now, both of these societies' early membership contained some of the era's most preeminent scientists, philosophers, scholars, lawyers, physicians, and others on both sides of the Atlantic. And despite the often repeated lie that the British and American societies never found anything, the simple fact of the matter is they gathered an enormous amount of evidence, and the evidence was so strong that by the early years of the 20th century, almost all of the original members that were still alive were convinced of the reality of survival, including the ones that started off as diehard skeptics, such as the lawyer Richard Hodgson, who started off in his investigations in order to debunk mediums. He pulled a 180 and then reversed his position in public and admitted he had been wrong. So I was very impressed with this. But what started me on my writing career was actually an online debate which I had with a so-called skeptic. I was wondering if I was fooling myself. I was becoming increasingly convinced by the evidence that we survived the deaths of our bodies. And I was wondering if I was fooling myself. And so I decided to see what arguments or evidence there was to the contrary. I came across a website devoted to debunking the belief in an afterlife. I wrote to the author. He wrote back, and we engaged in an online debate over several weeks. I gained great insight into the so-called skeptical way of thinking, and I was appalled by his ignorance and by the vehemence of his arguments. The quotes he supplied from other so-called skeptics were equally unimpressive. And so at the end of this debate, I decided that a book was needed to address these issues. And to make a long story short, the end result was my first 3 books.
I had similar experiences with skeptics, although not really getting into a debate, but, just asking and reaching out to them and, in very early grief, so very raw, and was kind of shocked and deeply relieved by their lack of curiosity and openness and thoroughness. And before we get too much into skeptics, I do want to ask you, you mentioned both the ASPR and the SPR in their historic research. Were there any studies that really stood out to you that blew you away?
Well, I'm not entirely sure you'd call them studies. They were, well, okay, they were case studies. They were studies of individual cases. I mentioned the lawyer Richard Hodgson, who started off as a skeptical, a skeptic in the true sense of the word, one who practices doubt, not one who practices denial. Most of these modern so-called skeptics are not skeptics at all; they're deniers. But there was a case. The case that convinced Richard Hodgson, that was with regards to one of his friends. James Pellew. I'm just trying to find the case here in my book. Yeah. His friend, George Pellew, he's a fellow lawyer. He died in an accident in New York City. And he had made a pact with Hodgson that whoever should die first would try to communicate from the other side. And at this time, Hodgson was investigating a medium named Leonora Piper. One day, Pellew, his friend, George Pellew, seemed to come through. And Hodgson, as a test, brought in dozens of different people, some of whom had known the living Pellew in life, and some who had not. And this entity communicating through Leonora Piper never failed to recognize the people, the friends and the relatives that he had known when he was alive on Earth. And there was never a single case of false recognition. That is, he never claimed to know somebody that he didn't know when he was alive. And he conversed. Sometimes he conversed using the vocal cords of the medium. Other times would be through automatic writing, really writing his answers on a piece of paper. But the manifestations of his personality were striking, and all of those people whom Pellew recognized were convinced that they were discussing and talking with their old friend. This is what Hodgson wrote. The continued manifestation of this personality, so different from Finuit or other communicators, with its own reservoir of memories, with its swift appreciation of any reference to friends of GP, with its give and take and little incidental conversations with myself, has helped largely in producing a conviction of the actual presence of the GP, George Pellew, personality, which it would be quite impossible to impart by any mere enumeration of verifiable statements. But this is something else Hodgson added. I had but one object, to discover fraud and trickery. Frankly, I went to Mrs. Piper and Professor James of Harvard University about 12 years ago with the object of unmasking her. I entered the house profoundly materialistic, not believing in the continuance of life after death. Today, I say I believe. The truth has been given to me in such a way as to remove from me the possibility of doubt. Now, what really convinced Pellew, remember I said that Pellew brought 120 people, that Hodgson brought 120 people to Mrs. Piper that the living Pellew had known, and he never failed to recognize any of them, with one exception. That one exception was a young woman who had been a child when Pellew had known her, named Miss Warner. Now, both Hodgson and Miss Warner knew that George Pellew had known her when she was a child. So sources for telepathy were readily at hand. And yet, George Pellew, speaking through Leonora Piper, the medium, failed to recognize her. He didn't know who she was. And then he asked her a series of questions. And then finally he figured it out. And he says, "Oh my goodness, are you Mrs. Warner's little daughter?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "My goodness, you've grown." And basically she had changed a great deal in the previous 8 years. Now, if extrasensory perception or living agent, ESP, whatever you'd like to call it, were in fact operating, then that hypothesis would predict recognition because, as I said, sources for telepathy were readily at hand. Hodgson and Miss Warner both knew that the living Pellew had known Miss Warner when he was alive. But he failed to recognize her, and the non-recognition is exactly what we'd expect if it were in fact George Pellew communicating through the medium, Mrs. Piper. And this is what really sealed it for Hodgson.
Yeah. And I mean, there is just so much very powerful evidence out there. That's just a drop in the bucket. And I know you researched the evidence, so we'll get more into that. But I want to talk about the skeptics. So my experience in early on, which I mean, I've written about in my book, and I was of the mindset, I studied this in deep, deep grief. I was desperate. I went into this thinking there was zero chance of an afterlife. And it took me a very long time, maybe like 6 years or something, before it fully sunk in that the skeptics weren't, I just assumed they were smarter and more educated in the areas I was studying. Therefore, they were seeing the reality and the catch that as I went further would become obvious to me. And I also wondered if grief, desperation, I just was convinced they saw some reality in the catch. And the further I dug, that was not the case for multiple reasons. And it sounds like you had, coming at it for different angles, you had a similar experience. What was your experiences like with the skeptics? I know you touched upon it. Why do you think they aren't the ones who just are seeing the reality? How do they approach this?
Well, Elizabeth, I think it's important to remember that most of these so-called skeptics are militant atheists. And one of the fundamental pillars of the atheistic worldview is the ancient doctrine of materialism. Now, this is the idea that all events ultimately have a physical cause, and so the mind is produced by the brain. Now, any evidence to the contrary provides a direct challenge to materialism. And if materialism is falsified by the evidence, then this pillar crumbles and thus threatens the collapse of their entire worldview. And I think that this, more than any other factor, explains the vehemence of their opposition to the evidence that falsifies materialism, whether it comes from the evidence for extrasensory perception or, even more threatening, the evidence for survival.
It almost sounds like the same approach if you were to speak to a fundamentalist religious person, because I can understand there's, for example, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Ed May. He'd done remote viewing. He doesn't think there's survival at all, but he says all this is happening and he thinks eventually physics is going to find an explanation that is not survival. But he doesn't deny all this is happening. I think the majority of them who study this do come to conclude there is an afterlife. So it goes past that with most of these skeptics. From what they don't delve in. From what I understand, they don't read. They don't do the level of research you or I have done. They glance at headlines. I mean, am I correct about that in your experience?
Yes, absolutely. I deal with Ed May in my book, by the way, in the case on the case of the chess game between living and deceased grandmasters.
Right. That's one of my favorites, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great case. It's one of the strongest in my opinion. But he tries to discredit the case by accusing the medium involved, Rollins, of being involved in pulling off this extraordinary fraud scenario where he's communicating with the Grand Master and he's traveling to Hungary and research obscure details. He provides not a single shred of evidence that Rollins actually committed fraud. This was an elderly, often sick man with an impeccable reputation for honesty, who did not take a dime for his work, did it all free of charge. There's absolutely no reason to think that he knew how to play chess. There's absolutely no evidence that he collaborated with a living chess master in order to pull off a hoax. There's absolutely no evidence that he traveled to Hungary in order to do in-depth research on the life of the deceased Geza Moroczy. He provides not a single shred of evidence. So what he does, is he uses the desperate tactic of trying to create the illusion of reasonable doubt by raising conceivable doubt. Of course, it's conceivable. We can imagine that Rollins pulled off this elaborate hoax without raising a single shred of suspicion among any of the people involved. But again, there isn't a single shred of evidence. So what May does is create conceivable doubt, but not reasonable doubt. And that's an important distinction in my book, because I argue in my book, The Case for the Afterlife, that the case has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt. And that's the only standard which is applicable in factual issues such as this. Conceivable doubt has no place when we're dealing with, factual issues, whether inside or outside of a courtroom.
Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the Science and Spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. Yeah, everyone, you have to read The Chess Case. It was one of my favorites, and you do a great job of really breaking it down. And from my knowledge of Ed May, he is a lot more open than most of the skeptics, so he at least examines it. And from what I understand, he's come to think that there is something going on that we just don't understand. I could be wrong about that, but that was what, but if he's giving it that much of a challenge, I guess my point is, you can imagine, I would see many who would debate these issues and then say, well, I never read the book. It's obviously insane. So yeah, I really like, that was one thing I really liked, that they insist upon a beyond a conceivable doubt, because you can find that there isn't anything in the whole world you can't find a beyond a conceivable doubt. You can invent a doubt for anything. Are there skeptics you know of who delved in and changed their mind as they went further?
Well, I mentioned the case of the lawyer Richard Hodgson. That's a dramatic case. He was convinced that his old friend George Pellew, with whom he'd entered into a pact, if one of them should die first, the other should try to communicate. He became utterly convinced that his friend George Pellew was communicating through the medium Lenora Piper. Now, Hodgson is a true skeptic, someone who suspends his belief, not someone who refuses to believe. Most of the opposition to the evidence really comes from, as I said, militant atheists, and they've got an ideological agenda to promote. They're not interested in evidence. To the contrary, they're interested in simply in promoting their agenda, their ideological agenda, I should say. Right.
And now, so you super delved into the evidence. What would you say is some of the evidence of an afterlife you found most compelling?
Well, in my book, Elizabeth, I discuss 5 independent lines of evidence. Deathbed visions, the near-death experience, children who claim to remember previous lives, reports of apparitions, and communications from the deceased via human mediums. The single most convincing line of evidence, I would say, would be the last one, alleged communication from the deceased via human mediums. And there's essentially 2 reasons for this. First of all, in the very best cases, what we have is not just information, which could arguably be explained by some form of living agent ESP, in other words, extrasensory perception within the minds of living, or some form of clairvoyance. In other words, the medium possesses these enormous powers of telepathy and clairvoyance, which allows him or her to instantly read the minds of anyone, regardless of what they're thinking about at the time, or to instantly go out and find books and articles and other documents to gather information. But that's not my dog, by the way.
No, that is Pickles, my little dog.
Yeah, I consider alleged communication from the deceased via human mediums to be the single most impressive line of evidence of the 5 that I discuss in my book. There's essentially 2 reasons for that. The first would be that in the very best cases, we have not just the provision of information, because this arguably could be explained by some form of extrasensory perception among the living, combined with, clairvoyance. In other words, we have to assume virtually unlimited powers of telepathy and clairvoyance from the medium. Okay, arguably. In the very best cases, we have far more than that. These communications seem to be from the perspective of the deceased. They seem to involve motives which can only be plausibly attributed to the deceased. We have demonstrations of the personality of the deceased, well enough to convince those who knew the deceased person that they were indeed conversing and receiving messages from their old friends or relatives. In the best cases, the medium had never met the deceased, yet they provide brilliantly convincing impersonations of the deceased. And in cases such as the chess game between a living and deceased grandmaster, we have the display of skills, high-level skills, which were never acquired by the medium, but which required the deceased person years of practice to require. So the instant and temporary acquisition of skills, high-level skills that the medium never spent any time acquiring, are displayed. These things are simply impossible to explain in terms of any form of perception, whether normal or extrasensory, super or otherwise. Perception, whether extrasensory or not, simply does not apply, cannot explain these cases, the best cases. That's the first reason why I think that mediumship provides a single most convincing line of evidence. The second is that in the best cases, it was standard practice with both the British and American Society of Psychical Research to record everything that the medium said or wrote. Nothing was left out. And so we have the permanent and objective evidence of the written documents, which can be studied by anyone at any time. And so the question of mistaken eyewitness testimony or malobservation simply does not apply.
Have you ever had a medium reading?
Never.
Never. Are you curious to get one, or you like more reading about it?
It's not a pressing concern of mine. The golden age of mediumship has long passed for a few reasons. One reason is the invention of radio and television. Back in the old days, before radio and television, people had to amuse themselves, and so they played musical instruments, they sang, they played cards, they played board games, and they sometimes attended seances. That's much less common today. The other reason is it's no longer being studied to anywhere near the extent that it was studied during the golden years of the British and American Society of Psychical Research, which is essentially from approximately 1880 to, say, 1940. And there's even possibly a third reason. Those on the other side said that they were on a mission to convince us of the reality of their survival. And if they've already done that, and I think they have succeeded, then there really isn't much point in them trying from their side to make the case or continue to make the case.
Wow. So you think they've succeeded at this point?
Well, my book is called
Completely.
The Case for the Afterlife, and I argue that the case has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, would you say you've moved, I know I went through layers of getting more and more. I'm still not 100% the way you are, but I'm always encouraged when people are. And you use a lot of legal terms in your book, which that's how my mind works too. I like that. That's kind of how I put it always together. And I'd always say, I now think there's a preponderance of evidence of an afterlife. And I actually would say I'm at probably where there's beyond a reasonable doubt. Would you say, was there like a point or turning point you'd say that moved you from a preponderance of evidence to beyond a reasonable doubt to, you'd say 100% at this point, you're convinced?
I don't like the term preponderance of evidence because that implies that there's evidence on the other side. There is no evidence that we do not survive. The main argument of the so-called skeptics that we do not survive is the so-called dependence of the mind on the brain. And they conclude from this that the brain, therefore, generates the mind. Well, there's a rival hypothesis, which also dates back to ancient times, and that's that the brain is the instrument of the mind. I think that the evidence indicates that the brain works as a two-way receiver-transmitter for the mind, sometimes from body to mind, as in sense perception, other times from mind to body, as in willed action. And it's not even necessary to bring in the evidence for survival in order to make this case. Mainstream medicine provides more than enough evidence. In my book, I discuss the well-known phenomenon, well-known among people who care for the ill, care for the dying, of terminal lucidity. There are many cases on record, long preceding the 20th century, of people suffering from dementia, Alzheimer's, or some other form of brain impairment, who in the days, hours, or minutes before death suddenly become perfectly lucid. And the nurses and other practitioners dealing with them often see this as a sign that death is imminent. In approximately 5 to 10% of Alzheimer's cases, the person becomes lucid, as I said, in the days, hours, or minutes preceding death. I mentioned one such case in my book about a woman who had been severe dementia. There was irreversible degradation in her brain tissue, and she'd been unresponsive to family members and friends for years. Suddenly, one day, she began talking to the nurse and asking to see her granddaughter. The nurse called her granddaughter and told her that her grandmother wishes to speak with her. When her granddaughter got there, she was amazed. She said it was like talking to somebody who'd been asleep for the past 20 years. And such cases, this phenomenon, I should say, was known since ancient times. Hippocrates wrote about it, Cicero, Galen, and others. And they all held the view that as death approached, the soul or the mind disengaged from the restrictions of a material brain and was able to finally, during the last moments of life, clearly express itself. So it's not even necessary to bring in the evidence for survival in order to prove that, to prove materialism false, that the brain does not generate the mind.
Right. And since on the topic also of like terminal lucidity and deathbed visions, sometimes healthy people often will see apparitions. And a lot of the skeptics, or more like fundamentalist skeptics, because I consider myself like a true skeptic and, those who research this. But the skeptics that are determined that they already know the outcome will say these apparitions, they're all hallucinations. What are your thoughts on that?
In my book, I mentioned several cases in which apparitions are perceived by different people at different times, and other cases in which they're perceived by several people at the same time and from the correct perspective. The simple fact of the matter is that people do not hallucinate in groups, and there's absolutely no evidence to this effect. Obviously, and I also mentioned cases in which animals react to the apparition. So are we supposed to say that animals are sharing in some sort of collective hallucination? It makes no sense.
Right. And people will report the same thing. But then also, would you use that same answer? Because a lot of the, fundamentalist skeptics will also say that when everyone says the same thing, it's the same as like faulty eyewitness testimony. And how do you respond to that? Because I know they usually come back with that response.
Well, what the skeptics will usually do in this case is that they'll mention some experiment or set of experiments that were done in psychology classrooms in university, in which there's some sort of stage event and then people disagree. The real life situation is different. If you get a group of witnesses, for instance, to a shooting, yes, they may disagree on whether the assailant had red hair or brown hair or a blue shirt or green shirt or fired 3 shots or 4, but they all agree on the fundamental facts of the case, that a shooting occurred. Mm-hmm. They may differ in incidental details, but that's good. You want different perspectives. If they all agree exactly on every single last detail, then the first thing a good defense lawyer will argue is they got together and colluded. And this is exactly what happens in legal cases, courtroom cases. Eyewitness testimony is not taken at face value. The law has an elaborate system of the cross-questioning of witnesses and squaring what they say with other facts of the case, such as forensic evidence. And this is done until a core of facts is established regarding the essential features of the case, not whether the assailant had red hair or brown hair, but whether or not it was that person who walked in on this day and pulled the trigger. The other thing, too, is that legal experts don't take these psychology studies very seriously, because real life is just very different. And I mentioned a case in my book about these two psychologists, Ewell and Cutshall. They investigated a case in which there was a shooting in broad daylight between a thief and a gun store owner. The thief had walked into a gun store, robbed the store at gunpoint, walked out. The store owner grabbed a revolver, followed the thief into the street where they exchanged gunfire. The thief fell dead. The gun store owner was wounded, but he survived. Anyway, Ewell and Cutshall interviewed 15 of the principal witnesses 5 months after the end of the trial, and they compared their answers with what the testimony they'd given in court, and they found it to be remarkably accurate. There was virtually no change at all. And this is what these two people concluded. We take issue with the essentially negative view of the eyewitness that has been consistently presented by most eyewitness researchers. In the present research, a different picture emerges. Most of the witnesses in this case were highly accurate in their accounts, and this continued to be true 5 months after the event. Yeah, so eyewitness testimony, contrary to what some skeptics will tell you, is in real life often and usually highly reliable.
Yeah, I personally agree with that too, for what that's worth. does the existence of ESP and afterlife contradict science? I know that skeptics say that a lot as well. And unfortunately, scientists will say that too.
That's actually a myth. Most scientists accept either the reality or the possibility of extrasensory perception. There's been studies, several studies, and they both confirmed this. And I mentioned this in my first book in quite detail. Most of the scientists who argue against the reality of extrasensory perception are actually psychologists and to a lesser extent biologists. And when you ask them why they hold this negative view, they'll almost invariably reply that, well, if these things were true, they'd turn the laws of physics upside down. But most physicists do not hold that view because most physicists know better. There's absolutely nothing in modern physics which would be contradicted by the existence of extrasensory powers such as telepathy or clairvoyance. Again, most of these objections from the scientific community come from psychologists invoking physics, not from the physicists themselves.
Yeah. And I guess, why do you think they tend to say they don't agree with any of this? Do you think it's like the social stigma?
That's part of it. Part of it is the name itself, parapsychology, which I actually absolutely despise. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake, who's done a lot of research into telepathy, mostly with animals, has come out and said it himself. I wouldn't want there to be a field called parabiology. So the name itself is considered to be an attack on the discipline of psychology. It makes them look a little flaky, and they don't like that. The discipline is misnamed. It shouldn't be called parapsychology. The original name was psychical research, and I honestly wish that the academic world stuck with that label.
Yeah. Oh, I never thought of that. I kind of go back and forth calling it both. I'll stick with cyclical research then. That's a good point because, yeah, I guess something that's called parapsychology or out there until the mechanism is known. Then it's just normal science or pseudoscience till mechanism is known, like meteorites. I do remember you touched upon meteorites in one of your books. Do you want to tell a little? Because, I mean, to me, things like that just show how things that are considered absurd end up being, 100 years later, just normal, everyday part of how the world works. So if you want to touch upon that a little.
Okay, well, that brings us to another so-called skeptical objection. And that's, how do these things work? How could it possibly be true? In other words, if we can't explain it, it can't be true. But that's a confusion between that something occurs and being able to explain how it occurs. And I like the example of meteorites. For decades, the existence of meteorites was denied by natural philosophers, what we today call scientists, on the grounds that rocks cannot fall from the sky because there are no rocks in the sky to fall. How could this possibly occur? And yet today, we take the existence of meteorites for granted. Another example that I give in my book is that of continental drift. That was first proposed by what was his name? Wegener, a fellow named Wegener, a geologist back in the 1920s, I think. He proposed this idea because he noticed there were similarities in fossils and rocks between, for instance, the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa. He also noticed that there were oil deposits in the Arctic, and indicating that these regions were once tropical. But this evidence for continental drift was ridiculed by geologists for decades because they couldn't think of how the continents could possibly drift. They're not floating on the oceans. How could this happen? It wasn't until the motion of tectonic plates was discovered, I believe in the 1960s, that they finally came around. An even more dramatic example, there was a physician, Austro-Hungarian physician, who proposed that physicians should wash their hands before assisting in childbirth or performing surgery. And he provided statistical evidence showing that in hospitals in which the physicians regularly washed their hands, there was much lower incidence of death by infection. And most physicians simply refused to wash their hands before surgery or childbirth because they couldn't think of how, because it made no sense to them. Why should washing their hands make any difference? My hands are clean. There's no dirt on them. I just wiped them on that rag a few minutes ago. And so thousands of people died needlessly because physicians refused to wash their hands on the grounds that it made no sense to them. So my point is that whether or not we can explain all the details of extrasensory perception or survival is simply irrelevant as to whether or not these things are real.
There's so many things that exist now that we don't understand how it works. Like from what I know, or from what I understand, we don't understand how anesthesia works, correct? That they cannot figure out the mechanism of how that works.
True.
Yeah. So there's still a lot today. Now, you have a chapter in your book that's titled The Mind-Body Relationship, and touches upon, the main argument that a lot of skeptics make, that our mind, our consciousness can't exist without a functioning brain. Because, the ultimate question is mind created by a brain or is it downloaded by a brain? What do you think the evidence shows about the actual relationship between our mind, personality, consciousness, and the brain?
I think the evidence indicates that the brain works as a two-way receiver-transmitter for the mind, sometimes from body to mind, as in sense perception, other times from mind to body, as in willed action. The rival hypothesis that the brain produces the mind has been proven false by the data, and it's not even necessary to invoke the evidence for survival in order to prove this idea of materialism false. We mentioned terminal lucidity earlier. Terminal lucidity, mainstream medical phenomenon, well known by people who work with the dying, proves that, in my opinion, that the brain does not produce the mind.
I know you mentioned you had a lot of discussions with skeptics, and we talked about, a few skeptics who changed their mind with the research. Have you ever had a discussion personally where you felt a skeptic opened their mind more or was willing to take another step?
Yeah. As a friend of the family, a professional philosopher, I discussed this and argued this with him several times. I think that I did succeed in moving the dial somewhat because he basically, smiled and said, well, it really makes you wonder. Mm-hmm. So you have to remember that most of us hold on to our opinions as prized possessions. And so we don't give them up easily. What most people try to do, especially if they've got an emotional commitment to a particular worldview, is come up with any excuse, regardless of how far-fetched, in order to salvage or protect their opinions.
Well, my question about that, I've heard that, but what I always don't understand is because I, until studying this, assumed without a doubt consciousness was created by a brain. There was no afterlife, and all of this was fake. And I hated feeling that way. I didn't let myself think about it because it was too sad. And then when I was forced to by the loss of my dad, I was searching for any hope, but it had to be tangible and it had to be realistic. And I was just astounded by the amount out there. What do you think their emotional attachment to materialism would be? Because to me, it's like the most bleak, horrible belief set or conclusion.
Well, the so-called skeptics are a mixed and motley crew, but what I think most of them have in common is a commitment to a materialistic worldview for a few different reasons. One one reason is some people just don't want to be held accountable for their lives. They don't want to be told how to live. They don't want even any suggestions on how to live. Do you think somebody like Vladimir Putin or Jeffrey Epstein want to be held accountable for the way they've lived their lives? Of course not. So they've got an emotional commitment to an atheistic or nihilistic worldview. I said before, they're mixed. As I said earlier, they're a mixed and motley crew. Some of these people started out as fundamentalist religious types. Then they went to university, and some pompous university professor, perhaps in a biology class, would have you convince them that their fundamentalist beliefs were false. They'd been misled. And so instead, they go from one ideological extreme to the other, because both are emotionally so similar. They're virtually identical. They're just opposite sides of the same coin. Ray Hyman, I mentioned him earlier, he remarked once to an engineer named George Hansen, who has researched the skeptical community in quite great detail. He candidly remarked one time, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, most parapsychologists are nice, honest people. Most skeptics, on the other hand, are nasty, cynical people. And I think this is true. There are people who may have been bullied when they were children, ostracized as teenagers, and so they retreated into a very sort of nerdy, materialistic, quasi-scientific worldview, partly out of anger towards the human race. I mean, somebody like James Randi, for instance, he grew up as a small, unathletic Jewish kid in 1930s Toronto, and he had a hard time making friends. That's why he started learning magic, so that he could have something that he could do that the other students, the other kids couldn't. And he expressed it in himself. He said when he grew up, he had a lot of anger towards the world. So, it's a combination of all these factors. They don't apply to all the so-called skeptics, of course, but it's really a case of, in many cases, one of a dislike, an anger towards religion, a desire not to be held accountable for the lives that they've led, desire to be free of any sort of religious or moral constraints, and an anger towards the world. And these things, obviously occur in the skeptics, a mixed and motley crew in different degrees and different people.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I find you can also still be an atheist and think the evidence of the afterlife is valid. I actually still consider myself an atheist. I don't think there's a God, but I think all the evidence shows that our consciousness is not created by a brain, but in some mechanism we don't understand that's downloaded by a brain. And that's my thought. I don't know. Just any thoughts on that?
Well, the evidence for a creator comes from scientific discoveries of the last 50 years in physics and astronomy and also in biology. And in the opinion of many scientists and some philosophers, the scientific findings of the last 50 years point unmistakably to the existence of a creator. Now, if a creator exists, that doesn't necessarily mean that we survive. Of course not. The two issues are distinct. But as I said before, the evidence for a creator comes from discoveries in science over the last 50 years. The universe itself seems designed to an extraordinary degree to support the existence of life. There's approximately 50 different constants which were set during the moment of creation, which if they were even just slightly different, we wouldn't be here. Even one of them were slightly different, we wouldn't be here. Now, and we're talking about approximately 50 different constraints that are known to be set to an almost unimaginable degree of precision in order to allow life to exist. Now, the atheists, the only thing that they can do, the physicists, for instance, who are non-believers and who are aware of these arguments, what they do is they come up with the unfalsifiable hypothesis of many worlds. Perhaps, this is only one universe among many. Perhaps there's an infinite number of universes. And an infinite number of universes, yes, you will occasionally get a universe capable of supporting life. But it's completely unfalsified. So the last 50 years point unmistakably to the existence of a creator. Now, if a creator exists, that doesn't necessarily mean that we survive. Of course not. The two issues are distinct. But as I said before, the evidence for a creator comes from discoveries in science over the last 50 years.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened.
The universe itself seems designed to an extraordinary degree to support the existence of life. There's approximately 50 different constants which were set during the moment of creation. If they were even just slightly different, we wouldn't be here. Even one of them were slightly different, we wouldn't be here. Now, and we're talking about approximately 50 different constraints that are known to be set to an almost unimaginable degree of precision in order to allow life to exist. Now, the atheists, the only thing that they can do, the physicists, for instance, who are non-believers and who are aware of these arguments, what they do is they come up with the unfalsifiable hypothesis of many worlds. Perhaps, this is only one universe among many. Perhaps there's an infinite number of universes. And an infinite number of universes, yes, you will occasionally get a universe capable of supporting life. But it's a completely unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific hypothesis. And if they try to present this as a scientific hypothesis, then they're quite literally practicing pseudoscience. It's not science at all. It's not even philosophy. It's ideology in order to support their worldview. And there's parallels with what the so-called skeptics are doing with the evidence for survival. They invoke elaborate fraud scenarios, or such as one I described by Ed May in order to explain away the chess case between living and deceased grandmasters. Or their last resort is the create these elaborate super ESP scenarios, which are completely unfalsifiable. What these do is they don't raise reasonable doubt. They don't provide evidence to suspect that that there may not be a creator or we may not survive. They don't create reasonable doubt. They create conceivable doubt. And so it's lack of distinction between conceivable and reasonable doubt, which allows them to claim that the case for survival has not been proved, despite the enormous evidence to the contrary.
And I think if I think of the entire world, you can put conceivable doubt in anything, even something you call a fact. Like you take the most tangible fact, then you can always make something up. Like, oh, how do you know you're not hallucinating this whole thing that you thought was your life? I mean, if you come up with any outrageous thing, you can play a philosophical game of putting conceivable doubt into anything, I feel. So, just bring in the simulation hypothesis and there you go. You put a reasonable doubt into even, is this really your parents? Well, how do you know? Maybe they just made a video game and you're getting into a game where you're experiencing your life for 1 hour and you go to different lives and it erases the memory. I mean, it's fun. It's a game, but you can do it with anything,
Well, the only realms in which we can prove anything beyond all conceivable doubt is that of pure mathematics and pure logic. Right. I mean, consider the simple example. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A must be greater than C. It's simply inconceivable that C would be greater than A. But the only reason we can attain such mathematical certainty is because A, B, and C are purely abstract entities in a purely abstract argument. Once we move from the realm of pure mathematics and logic into the realm of facts and empirical issues, conceivable doubt no longer applies. And when we deal with factual matters, the best we can do is proof beyond all reasonable doubt. Now, what do I mean by that? I argue in my book that a statement is proved beyond all reasonable doubt. We have good reasons to believe it is true, and no good reason to believe it may be false. And this is the only standard that's applicable to factual matters, whether inside or outside of a courtroom. The reason why speculation is not allowed in criminal trials is because pure speculation without any supporting evidence raises the burden of proof on the prosecution from beyond all reasonable doubt to beyond all conceivable doubt. Of course, we can imagine that the police detectives framed O.J. Simpson, but there wasn't a shred of evidence, a shred of credible evidence that they in fact did so. Simpson walked on that case, despite the enormous evidence against him, because the defense attorney, the so-called dream team, managed to create conceivable doubt in the minds of the jury. And remember, this was after the Rodney King beating, and the jury, was understandably somewhat distrustful of the LAPD. But this is a common tactic among defense lawyers. Try to raise the illusion of reasonable doubt by raising conceivable doubt. And I argue in my book that the skeptics have not succeeded in raising reasonable doubt.
Yeah, I've come to agree with you on that. You were talking about a creator, but it's also possible it's biocentrism, right? That it's a collective. All of us have created this too. That it's not necessarily one individual creator, that our consciousness out of a body created this to go experience. I mean, we don't know if it's an individual creator, group creation. Any thoughts on that?
Again, I see that as simply fantastic. I don't think there's a shred of evidence to support that. Of course, it's conceivable, but unless there's evidence for it, I'm not going to believe it. I mentioned the case for a creator. There's a book by exactly that name by former militant atheist Lee Strobel. He's a lawyer and a former legal journalist. And anyway, he interviewed various scientists and philosophers. And his book, The Case for a Creator, is very accessible. It's very entertaining. As a legal affairs journalist, he writes in a very engaging manner. So that's probably the best place to start for anyone who's curious about the scientific evidence for the existence of a creator of the universe.
Yeah, I'm interested. You mentioned a lot of the historical studies. Is there any research now that you think is going on that you're excited about?
Well, I have to admit, I don't follow all of the latest research carefully. A couple of reasons for that. One reason is I'm a very busy person. I don't have the time to be combing through the literature. The other reason is that I think my impression of the literature that I do see is that right now, most of the research on the so-called cutting edge has to deal with what I consider to be very minor issues, sort of like mopping up operations, like various research into what is going on in the states of people who are dying, or what's going on in states of extreme oxygen deprivation, things like that. Basically, what these I'm talking about, of course, the near-death experience. My impression is that a lot of these physicians, mostly cardiologists who are doing this research, are trying to refute certain far-fetched skeptical, pseudo-skeptical objections that the brains of dying people are somehow generating these experiences because of some tiny little undetected electrical activity in the brains of the dying. So much of the research that I see today is it's highly technical. I'm not saying all of it is. I think that more research could perhaps be done in terminal lucidity. But again, in my book, I argue that the case for the afterlife has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt. I think it was proven beyond all reasonable doubt decades ago. As I said earlier, by the early years of the 20th century, most of the surviving members of the British and American Society of Psychical Research, the surviving founding members of the British Society of Psychical Research, were convinced of the reality of survival, including many of those who started off as diehard skeptics, such as the lawyer Richard Hodgson and others. So I think the case has been proven, and it's like if somebody writes a book with additional evidence that OJ did it. Well, I mean, what's the point? I was convinced of his guilt, when I first read about the case and started researching that case several years ago. I became interested in it and started reading some books and articles on the case, watching documentaries. So, I mean, once a case has been made, there's no real point in continuing to investigate it. I mean, nobody continues to prove that rocks sometimes fall from the sky.
It's encouraging to hear how convinced you are. I'm not there yet, but I'm close. I'm convinced something's going on, and I sincerely hope the answer is survival. I think it's most likely, but I still have that could be something else. Not completely. I'm the most convinced I've ever been, but it's obviously not an emotionally neutral topic, so it goes beyond just a curiosity.
No, remember, though, what originally started me writing these books was a debate with a so-called skeptic. And
Right.
I was entirely unimpressed by both what he wrote and by the people that he quoted. And that launched me into an investigation and eventual critique of the skeptical literature. I'm not impressed by their arguments. I don't think that any of their arguments raise reasonable doubt, only conceivable doubt, which is simply not relevant to any factual matter. And also, you have to remember that in my books, I deal with 5 independent lines of evidence for survival, all very different from each other, all pointing in the same direction.
I'm curious, when you first began the debate with skeptics, how were you expecting them to react? Were you I know I was pretty shocked by how they acted. The lack of curiosity, I'd say, was the main thing with me, and the lack of actually delving into what they're talking about or wanting to delve in further.
They react pretty much the same way that the skeptic I originally debated over several weeks reacted. They're all very dogmatic. Most of them haven't got a clue what they're talking about. They're not familiar with the evidence. A common tactic is to simply repeat the often repeated lie that the British and American Society's researchers never found anything, when nothing could be further from the truth. They'll try to explain the near-death experience in terms of oxygen deprivation, which has been completely falsified. They're just they strike me as very angry, dogmatic, narrow-minded people who are grasping at anything in order to hold on to their belief system.
How has the near-death experience been proven to not be hallucination of the brain?
We can never prove beyond all conceivable doubt
Right.
that there isn't some sort of hallucination going on. But again, that's a standard of evidence which simply does not apply. The most common skeptical objection is that the near-death experience is caused by a reduction of oxygen to the brain, which is what occurs during cardiac arrest. If the heart stops beating, then the supply of blood to the brain ceases, and the brain is starved of oxygen and glucose. This is known as hypoxia in the medical literature. Now, the effect of reduced oxygen supply has been known for a long time. Mountain climbers have experienced it. Pilots flying at high altitude have experienced it. And it used to be common practice in medical schools to have medical students exposed to reduced oxygen supply. What they would do is that they would have the students breathe into a spirometer with a carbon dioxide filter. So as they were breathing, they would be breathing less and less oxygen, more and more nitrogen, but they wouldn't feel that they were suffocating because the carbon dioxide was being filtered out. At the same time, they were asked to perform some simple task. What would happen was they would become, their performance would increasingly degrade until eventually they would become very disoriented and simply pass out. Now, in thousands of such experiments on thousands of medical students, not once did anyone report a near-death experience. And pilots in training have to undergo oxygen deprivation in flight simulators. This is in order to see if they can get their masks on in time. And those who fail don't have near-death experiences. They just become increasingly disoriented and trying to do things like land their simulated planes on top of simulated clouds until they finally pass out. I'm not aware of a single pilot in this situation having a near-death experience. So again, the effects of oxygen deprivation are well known and nothing like the experiences commonly reported during a near-death experience.
In fact, I have to find his name, but there was a pilot who had experienced that type of oxygen deprivation and ended up having a near-death experience at a later time and said the two were not even comparable. So,
yeah, Alan Pring, he was in the RAF during the Second World War. So he experienced oxygen deprivation while flying at high altitude. Years later, he had a near-death experience. He simply said the two experiences are not even remotely alike.
You are so knowledgeable of the history. I'm so impressed by that. You are like walking into the SPR library. So is there a case that just blows you away, maybe that didn't make it into your book, that you'd love our listeners to hear about?
Well, it's hard for me to think of such a case. There is some of the cross correspondences which I didn't have room for. One of them was the so-called Hope Star and Browning case. This involved a complicated set of cross correspondences with deceased British Society of Psychical Research founding father Frederick Myers. He was a classic scholar. Anyway, it's quite an interesting case, and I was asked to write about it, and it should be published in England in a journal, or a magazine, I should say, which I'm told is widely available in bookstores, both in England and in the United States. So perhaps your listeners could keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. Do you want to tell what happened, or is it too in-depth? Should they wait to read it?
It's too in-depth. It's, the devil's in the details.
Okay. And so is there anything else you want to add that I haven't asked you?
Not really. But if listeners are interested in learning more about this book, I suggest they go to my publisher's website. My publisher is Llewellyn. Now that's spelled a little tricky. Let's see here. Spelled Llewellyn, Llewellyn. And they can just go to the publisher's website, enter, The Case for the Afterlife by Chris Carter. And if they do that, they'll be able to read a description of the book. They'll be able to read endorsements of the book. And they'll also be able to read a short essay that I wrote, Can the Afterlife be proven beyond all reasonable doubt? Or they call it, Can we prove the existence of the afterlife? Can't remember the exact title, but to be able to read a short essay which basically summarizes my views, which I express in my latest book.
And is there somewhere they can find all your studies? Is that just Google?
Well, I prefer to use the search engine DuckDuckGo.
I do too, actually. Yes.
They don't store your information. They don't sell it to third parties.
I'm in agreement. I actually use them, or Ecosa. I think I'm pronouncing it right, which is eco-friendly and plants trees. So we're in alignment with that. Glad to give DuckDuckGo a shout out here. And thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for your books, your vast knowledge of history, research. I so appreciate it. And you're taking on the skeptics who hopefully, will become to be more genuine skeptics out there that truly delve in. as opposed to fundamentalist. So thank you.
My pleasure, Elizabeth.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_ or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?